The county of Somerset, a land of green pastures and quiet villages, of ancient churches and fields untouched by time, a place where life moves to the steady rhythm of the land from the break of dawn to the setting sun. In the small village of North Perrott near the town of Crewkerne, Mr. Sykes, a local farmer, was just setting off on his day. He milked the cows and then led them to a field, walking the distance of Trindlewell Lane. It should have been like any other day on the farm, but today was different. On the morning of March 17th, 1874, something lay hidden in this field. Something that did not belong here, and as Mr. Symes turned his cows into pasture that day, his eyes fell upon it. A shape, half buried in the mud, motionless, unnatural, a woman, face down, lifeless. What happened in this field on that cold March night would send shock waves through the town of Crewkerne and beyond. A murder so brutal, so grotesque, that even in an age of violence and hardship, it was spoken of in hushed tones. A murder that was never solved. That is, not solved until now. It was not just a murder, it was a desecration, the kind of crime that put the country on edge. What had been done to her was something out of the very worst nightmares, and as the authorities surveyed the scene, it became horrifyingly clear whoever had killed her had wanted her to suffer. Her skull had been shattered in multiple places, her jaw broken, her nose caved in, one of her eyes was missing, and perhaps most grotesquely of all, her ears had been severed. Why? Was it rage? Was it ritual? Or was it a calculated act, something done to send a message? Even in an era of public hangings and violent crimes, this was something different. This was something obscene. Crewkerne was no stranger to hardship, a town built on industry where men and women toiled at the looms, where Sunday church bells rang out over a landscape of quiet endurance. But something had changed. The murder was not just a crime, it was a wound, cut deep into the heart of the town. The people of Crewkerne went about their business, but the talk in the alehouses, the whispers at the market stalls, all returned to the same uneasy question: who had done it? And worse still, would they strike again? The first man to take charge of the investigation was Police Constable Williams of Crewkerne. A steady hand in a town where crime was usually petty theft or drunken brawls, Williams was now faced with something far darker. A murder unlike anything this town had ever seen. The constable, accompanied by Superintendent Everett of Ilminster, arrived at the crime scene within hours, pacing the blood-stained hedgerows, staring into the mud where the body had been forced down. He had seen death before, but not like this, not with such it was then. Beyond that, the open pasture, and just to the right, near the tree line, lies the mud pit, where her body was found, face down, pressed deep into the earth. Standing here, looking out across the fields, it's not hard to imagine the isolation of that night. No houses nearby, no witnesses, just darkness and silence. When the first officers arrived at the scene, the sheer violence of what had happened was immediately clear. Ruth Butcher's body lay in a shallow mud pit, her head wedged so tightly into the earth that it took considerable force to free her. Her clothing was torn, her face unrecognizable from the brutal blows she had suffered. But this was not just a killing, it was an assault of pure, uncontrolled rage. Her ears had been severed, her nose smashed inward, and her jaw fractured beyond repair. One of her eyes had been forced from its socket. The ground around her told its own story. A desperate struggle. The first clue was the trail of blood leading from the gate to the very spot where her body was found. This suggested she had not simply been killed where she lay, she had been dragged. Along the hedgerows, officers found tufts of hair caught in the thorns alongside broken branches and disturbed earth, indicating that Ruth had fought for her life. Further back along the lane, near the gate, bloodstains marked where the first attack had likely begun. The evidence pointed to a sustained, frenzied assault, first by the roadside, and then, after she had been overpowered, her body was hauled across the field to be left in the mud. But there was something else. In the pocket of the woman's dress, the officers discovered a piece of bacon, wrapped in paper and tied with jute yarn, the kind commonly used in textile factories. It was an odd detail, seemingly unconnected, but one that would later become crucial in forming suspicions about the killer. As the investigators pieced together the grim evidence before them, one thing was certain. This was no robbery, no random act of violence. This was personal. The sheer brutality of the attack suggested not just an intent to kill, but an intent to obliterate. The injuries were excessive, far beyond what was needed to end a life. This was hatred, rage, fury unleashed. But what kind of person would do this, and why? The first question the detectives asked was whether Ruth had known her killer. There were no signs of valuables missing, no indication that she had been set upon by a passing stranger looking for money. Whoever had done this had wanted her dead, not just killed, but destroyed. And then there was the way she had been left. A body is rarely hidden unless the murderer fears discovery. Ruth had not been left in the open. She had been dragged, positioned, and pressed into the mud, as though the killer had wanted to ensure that life had truly left her. This suggested calculation. It suggested a mind that was not simply violent, but deliberate. Then there was the location itself. Trendlewell Lane was not a place where an opportunistic killer would strike. It was isolated, a spot that only locals knew well. The police quickly dismissed the idea of a travelling vagrant or an unknown assailant passing through. No, this crime had been committed by someone familiar with North Perrott and its surroundings. And if the killer was local, then they were still walking among the townspeople. The detectives turned to the last known movements of the victim. She had been working at her loom earlier that day, tending to her cottage, and had sent her son on an errand. Then, sometime after dark, she had left her home. But why? Had she planned to meet someone? Had she been called out into the night by a voice she recognized? Then there was the bacon. That small, seemingly insignificant detail, a piece of bacon wrapped in jute yarn found in her pocket. Had someone given it to her? Now let us look at the victim. Who was she, and what was her For Ruth, misfortune would strike early. Ruth was born when poverty shaped lives utterly. Her father, Amos Butcher, a mere agricultural labourer, toiled amid England's fields, nameless, relentless, broken by seasons and landowners' whims. His existence a gruelling, powerless struggle against nature and mastery. Ruth grew amid economic shadows. By 1841 she dwelt in Piddletown, Hazelbury Plucknett. By 1851 a linen weaver, gruelling toil for her ilk. Yet industrialization loomed, marginalizing old crafts, rendering her fragile life ever more precarious. But despite her hardships, Ruth did what so many women of her time were forced to do. She endured. In 1858, at the age of 26, she gave birth to her daughter, Anne Butcher. There is no record of the father, and whether he was absent by choice or circumstance remains a mystery. For an unmarried woman, having a child out of wedlock was not only a source of personal difficulty, but also social disgrace. She would have been the subject of whispers in the village, a mark against the rigid morality of Victorian England. Then, almost a decade later, in 1867, Ruth had a second child, John Butcher. Again, the father is unknown and the circumstances of his birth remain obscure. What is clear, however, is that by this time, Ruth's situation was becoming increasingly dire. Just months after John's birth, in September 1867, her mother, Sarah Cornick, died. Sarah had lived with Ruth in Hazelby Plucknett, and her death may well have been the final push that sent Ruth into the bleakest chapter of her life. By the early 1870s, Ruth had made a life for herself in the village of North Perrott. She had carved out an existence, precarious no doubt, but an existence nonetheless. For a time she shared a home with a widower named Robert Marks, a man who, like Ruth, had endured his own share of misfortune. Theirs was a relationship of necessity rather than romance, two people battered by circumstance seeking comfort in the familiarity of hardship. Marks, however, was not a man to settle. After a time he abandoned Ruth and vanished from the village, leaving behind not only her, but also 4 children. By 1871, Ruth Butcher was living in the Yeovil Union Workhouse. These institutions, designed to offer relief to the destitute, were in reality places of suffering and degradation. Families were separated, forced into strict regimes of labour, their independence stripped from them entirely. The site of the Yeovil Workhouse is now Summerlands Hospital. As we can see from this map of the site, the main octagonal building housed a prison-like environment. Today, only the front entrance of the workhouse survives, here on Preston Road in Yeovil. But Ruth was nothing if not resilient. At some point she left the workhouse and returned to North Perrott, determined to reclaim her independence. She found employment as a washerwoman and charwoman, scraping together what little she could to support herself. A cottage in the main street of North Perrott became her home, a modest shelter that for a time provided her with some semblance of stability. But even this would not last. Just weeks before her murder, Ruth was forced to leave her cottage. The landlord had other plans for the property, and Ruth was given no choice but to relocate. Her new home, a much smaller cottage at Pillhead Lane, was positioned at the edge of the village, a lonely, vulnerable place for a woman with few allies. This was where she would live out her final days. Ruth Butcher's final home in North Perrott on Pillshead Lane has now since long gone, but looking at Ordnance Survey maps from the time we can clearly see where the row of 3 cottages once stood. Today this is an overgrown lane, but perhaps the foundations remain, waiting to be uncovered. By the time she had settled into her small cottage at Pillhead Lane, Ruth Butcher's daughter Anne had begun working as a servant and was away for many months. Ruth and her young son John were alone in the cottage, and Ruth was reliant on whatever work she could find. Ruth was kept in employment by a man called John Genge. Genge, a Crewkerne man who owned a factory on Middle Path, installed a loom in Ruth's cottage so she could work at home. Genge, however, was a nefarious figure who would make unreasonable demands and threats to Ruth, later claimed by her daughter. Around this time in 1874, 1 month from the time of her murder, it was said that Ruth was intimate with Charles Baker, a member of the notorious Hutchings gang who operated out of Hardington, Mandeville, though it was said Ruth had enjoyed the company of many in her last months. As the evening light faded on Monday, March 16, 1874, Ruth prepared for another night alone in her Pillhead Lane cottage. The village was settling into quiet, but she was seen moving about by neighbours. Some reported that she received a visitor, though no one could say for certain who it was. Witnesses recalled that Ruth had been cautioned by her landlord not to allow men into her home, yet there were murmurs that someone had been there that night. A man, it was said, had been seen lurking near her cottage, but in the darkness no one could make a clear identification. No blood was found inside the cottage, but the discovery of one boot and one stocking there suggests she left hurriedly or was forcibly taken. If she had been attacked in her home, there would be signs of struggle, yet there were none. Did she step out voluntarily, unaware of the danger that awaited her? A shawl belonging to Ruth was found in a field opposite the lane between Pillhead Lane and Trindlewell Lane. This suggests that at some point she was either running or forced through the fields. The fact that the shawl was discarded rather than torn might indicate it fell off as she ran away. The lane where Ruth's body was found bore clear signs of violence. Blood pools found 3 yards apart suggest multiple blows or a struggle where she was knocked down repeatedly. Drag marks show she fought against her attacker, and a large stone wrapped in cloth found near her was covered in blood. When 6-year-old John Butcher awoke the following morning, screams and cries were heard across North Perrott. The little boy couldn't find his mother. Ruth Butcher had been viciously slaughtered. What happened in North Perrott sent shockwaves through Crewkerne. People became growingly suspicious of their fellow residents as word spread that the killer may have come from Crewkerne. The workers of Viney Mills and Crewkerne's vast textile industry were abound with rumours. Was there a killer walking amongst them? As word of the murder quickly spread, it became a matter of sensation and national importance. Thousands of people descended upon North Perrott to view the scene of the atrocity. This was one of the most brutal crimes of the 19th century, and it happened here. Victorian grief tourists removed and cut away most of the hedges from the scene at Trindlewell Lane, looking to keep grim mementos. Meanwhile, the police investigation suspected the killer fled through a sty in a neighbouring field, where blood was found, indicating they must have stepped over it. The directions suggested they escaped toward Crewkerne. John Genge became a key suspect after his name surfaced in multiple witness statements. Ruth's daughter testified that Genge had frequently quarrelled with her mother, demanding to live with her. He had openly threatened Ruth, saying he would knock her down, a threat that now carried dark significance. When news of the murder spread, Genge reacted with volatility. Rather than maintaining his innocence, he confronted PC Warren with violent language, resulting in his arrest. His house was searched for any trace of evidence linking him to the crime, yet nothing suspicious was found. John Genge, born in Crewkerne in 1830, built a reputation that stretched far beyond his trade as a web manufacturer. A man of violence, temper and influence, he and his son Francis were at the heart of a rough crew who caused chaos in Crewkerne's streets. Genge married Elizabeth Denman in 1849, and they had 5 children, but their home was anything but peaceful. He was regularly arrested for drunken fights, domestic violence, and assaults on police officers. In 1873, he was charged with brutally attacking his own son. Francis Genge, known as Fussy, followed in his father's footsteps, a man just as quick to throw a punch as he was to flee from the law. Fussy was involved with poaching and extorting businesses. His father may have built the gang, but Francis kept the family name feared on Crewkerne streets. In 1886, Francis was arrested for savagely beating his wife, threatening to cleave her skull open with an axe. He forced her into the street, kicked her repeatedly, and terrorized the household. The courts called him a brute, but it was a learned behavior from his father, John Genge. The Genge family empire centered around a webbing factory on Middle Path in Crewkerne, the building of which still stands today. Weaving and webbing was a big industry in Crewkerne during the 19th century. As we can see here, Middle Court in Crewkerne was actually Genge factory. John Genge and his family lived in the adjoining cottages, but stripping back the layers, we can see how this would have looked during the time of John Genge. Here he directly employed Ruth Butcher at her home in North Perrott. It is remarkable that this building still exists. Many pass it daily, unknowing of the history here. The Genge men were rarely alone in their crimes. They ran with a circle of equally violent men, drinking deep, fighting hard, and avoiding the law when they could. In 1881, John Genge was found bloodied after a tavern brawl, squaring up to anyone who dared challenge him. Crewkerne knew their name well. Even when John attempted respectability, purchasing properties and selling his webbing factory in 1901, his past loomed over him. The Genge gang still prowled the town, and whispers of their crimes never faded. Many believed John had been involved in Ruth Butcher's murder. By 1912, John Genge finally met his end at 82. His legacy wasn't one of industry or success, but of fear, chaos, and suspicion. The Genge name lingered, a reminder of a family who ruled Crewkerne's underworld, their fists doing the talking, and the courts always at their heels. In the weeks following Ruth Butcher's murder in 1874, detectives at Crewkerne police station had placed John Genge down as their prime suspect. One of the most peculiar pieces of evidence found at the scene was a piece of bacon, wrapped in jute yarn, tied with a weaver's knot. The detail caught investigators' attention. Jute yarn was uncommon outside the weaving industry. Suspicion turned toward John Genge again. The yarn was consistent with the materials used in his trade, raising the question, was Ruth's murder linked to her employer? Detectives pieced together Ruth's final moments. She had fled her home, losing her boot and stocking along the way. Bloodstains suggested she had been dragged and repositioned, fueling speculation that her killer hadn't worked alone. A single attacker would have struggled to move her body without being seen or leaving more evidence. The presence of a shawl in a nearby field added to the mystery. If Ruth had been pursued, why was it discarded so far from the final crime scene? Investigators suspected she had been chased, her attacker forcing her toward Trendlewell Lane, where she was ultimately overpowered. But had a second man helped in the ambush? Despite an exhaustive search, no murder weapon was found in 1874. Detectives drained the pond where Ruth's body was discovered, hoping the killer had discarded it in the water, but nothing surfaced. The absence of a weapon only deepened the mystery. What had inflicted the brutal wounds upon her face and skull? A bloody stone was found beside Ruth's body, stained with gore. Investigators noted it appeared to have been taken from a nearby wall. While it may have been used to strike her, it could not account for all her injuries. Some wounds suggested blunt force, but others, deep cuts to her nose, ears, and the removal of an eye, indicated something sharper. With 8 wounds to the head, detectives speculated Ruth had been battered multiple times. A blade or sharp tool had likely been used to carve at her face. But no such weapon was found. If the killer had carried a knife, they had taken great care to remove all trace of it from the crime scene. The precision of some wounds raised questions. Had her attacker intended to mutilate her, or had the cuts been inflicted in a frenzy? Without the weapon, police could only guess. Theories ranged from a workman's tool to a concealed dagger. The lack of a murder weapon fueled rumours that there had been 2 attackers. One may have wielded the stone to incapacitate her, while the other used a blade for the more gruesome injuries. Yet, with no forensic science to confirm such theories, police were left with speculation rather than proof. After months trying to solve the murder of Ruth Butcher, detectives working on the case drew no fresh clues, and the case was shelved, as one Western Gazette reader put it at the time. Vital clues had been missed, and the horrific murder became lost in the annals of Victorian history. Until now. In Crewkerne, life returned to normal, though the murder was fresh in the mind of residents. People never forgot the famous Swan Hotel, which hosted many Victorian grief tourists who sought to visit the scene, now played host to the likes of John Genge, who continued a violent life. Genge had remained the police #1 suspect, but as we shall discover, other suspects remained totally undetected. One man in North Perrott died of shock following the murder. This community was hit harder than anywhere, given the close vicinity and popularity of Ruth in the village. On March 20th, 1874, Ruth Butcher was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave at St Martin's Church in North Perrott. The community paid for her coffin, and the funeral was widely attended. Ruth's daughter Anne was said to cry throughout. Young John was oblivious to the proceedings, given his age. It was a touching moment, for a life that ended violently was spent miserably. That would have been the end of it, but then there was another murder.